So what are the main functions of your cerebrum? It has two distinct tissues. The cortex, the cerebral cortex, is the outer gray matter. All right, so there's a layer on the surface of the cerebrum, so it's the more superficial layer. It's gray matter, called the cerebral cortex, contains a lot of our sensory, motor, and association areas. So these are interpreting our senses, sending out signals to, say, muscle, and then doing a lot of the interpretation of our senses. And that's done using association areas. So again, sensory areas are involved in the perception of sensory information. Could be touch, pain, temperature, vision, hearing, taste, smell. Those are sensory areas. Motor areas control voluntary movements. And then association areas deal with more complex integrative functions. So these are the areas that use memory, personality, intelligence to make a lot of our decisions. There's areas called the hippocampus, which is involved in learning and memory. The amygdala is involved in social behavior and emotions. And basal nuclei, which are involved in controlling muscle activity, posture, and they're involved in inhibiting unintentional movements when you're resting. We're not going to talk too much about these three. We're going to talk a lot more about these sensory areas, motor areas, and association areas. So let's first take a look at the anatomy. So this is kind of your classic surface anatomy of the brain. We've already learned about the cerebellum down here. Notice you can see the folia, those little folds on the surface. This would be the spinal cord here, and then as it goes up, the medulla is kind of hidden. The pons is up here, so you can't really see the brainstem very well on this image, but it's going to be there. Deep on the inside is the diencephalon, which again you can't see from the surface. So what are we looking at here? Let's identify the lobes. First off, I never want to forget the insula lobe. So the insula lobe is on the inside. It's not found on the surface. You would have to move some of this out of the way and look on the inside for that insula lobe. That's the one students always forget because you don't see it on the surface. And inside that insula lobe, we have what's called the gustatory area, which receives and evaluates taste information. All right, so the insula lobe is involved in taste. Frontal lobe is in the front here. We're going to learn a lot of areas in the frontal lobe. One area is in this fold here called the precentral gyrus. That controls your voluntary motor function. So when you want to move your arms, your legs, your head, that comes from that area. It also has motivation, aggression, mood, intelligence, personality, and a lot of your decision making is in your frontal lobe. Situated behind the frontal lobe is the parietal lobe. Parietal lobe evaluates a lot of your sensory information, especially what we call your somatosensory. That's the senses on your skin. So if you think of anything that you can sense on your skin, touch, temperature, pain, those things are going to the parietal lobe for perception and evaluation, all right, or reception and evaluation. Notice there's a groove here. This sulcus is a very important landmark. It's called the central sulcus. It separates the frontal from the parietal. It also separates two of the really important folds here. This is the precentral. Again, that's going to do most of our motor function, control skeletal muscle. And then behind it is the postcentral gyrus. That's going to be receiving a lot of our somatosenses, senses from the body. In the back is the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe receives and integrates vision. So it's involved in receiving our visual sense and then interpreting that, integrating it, meaning, understanding what we see. And then finally, we have the temporal lobe. That's involved in the reception, perception, evaluation of smell, hearing. It's got some memory component in there, abstract thought, and judgment. All right. There's another landmark here called the lateral fissure. So that kind of separates the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe. All right. So those are the lobes shown in purple and what they in general do. We're going to get into a little more detail. And then in red are some of the anatomical landmarks that are found on the surface of the cerebrum. All right, now we're going to use this pretty picture to identify what we call functional areas. So we're actually identifying and attaching a specific function to some of these areas of the cerebral cortex. All right, so let's first make sure everything's up there. Okay, oops, they're all there. One of them we don't really see here is the primary olfactory. So for this one, we're not going to identify it because it's kind of deep in the temporal lobe, so you don't really see it from the surface here. But your primary olfactory receives impulses from your olfactory epithelium in your nasal cavity, and that's in charge of your smell. All right, so temporal lobe, olfactory, smell. The next one we're going to look at is auditory. So that's also found in the temporal lobe. That's this kind of, what color would that be? It's kind of a maroon color. So it's superior portion of the temporal lobe. That receives impulses from your hearing receptors. All right, there's a structure called the cochlea, which is involved in hearing. So that's known as the primary auditory. Here is that primary somatosensory area. So again, that an anatomical region is called the post-central gyrus, and that's in the parietal lobe. All right, this is parietal lobe. And that receives impulses of touch, proprioception, which is body movements, pain, and temperature. So that's all perceived in this primary somatosensory. There's a gustatory area here. Now that's, again, in the insula lobe, so it's going to be deep in that lobe. And that receives the impulses from taste. And then when the way back of the occipital lobe is what's called your primary visual area. And that receives impulses from your retina of your eye. So these are all sensory, and they're involved in perception. Now, to analyze it, we're going to use other areas. All right, so this is just perception. All right, but we're going to have to use memory, intelligence to make sense of those senses. And that's going to be using what we call association areas. And we'll come to those in a little bit. But let's look at the motor areas. So these are some of the more important motor areas. So motor areas initiate impulses to skeletal muscle in order for voluntary movements to occur. The main one is here. So this is that precentral gyrus of the frontal lobe. So you'll notice all three of these are found in the frontal lobe. So this is going to initiate impulses to skeletal muscle and controlling your body movements. This area here, called the premotor area, because it's basically in front of the primary motor, does more of what we call your muscle memory. So when you have, repetition, pattern movements, and you've done these movements over and over and over again, the premotor area develops the ability to kind of do this very well. All right, so muscle memory. Riding a bike involves muscle memory. Driving a car involves muscle memory. All right, so that's done in the premotor area, planning and organizing movements. Then there's a really special area here called Broca's area. Broca's speech area is a motor speech area, meaning it's kind of dedicated to any muscles that are involved in speech. Okay, it's usually in the left side of the brain only, and it's going to control muscles in your tongue that are involved when you're speaking. All right, so again, it's a motor area. dedicated to muscles of speech. What's very interesting is what's called the homunculus. So homunculus is a kind of a description of a little man. It's kind of mythical little man, but what we've done, or what they've done, is they've come up with kind of a map of the primary motor. So we're looking at the primary motor here and the somatosensory area here. And they've actually figured out where the neurons go from each part of this primary motor. All right, so they know that the neurons here, all right, we could probably say that that's probably right about here, are going to go to the arm. All right, and they're gonna control muscles there. If it's in the wrist, we're going to move down a little ways to here. So maybe we'll move from here to here, and those neurons go to the wrist. If we move all the way down maybe here, now we're at muscles that go to the face or the tongue. And then if we go way down over down here, we're probably looking at muscles that help you swallow. If we go way in the little crevice here, we would go to neurons that go to the toes. So they've actually figured out where exactly those neurons go to control skeletal muscle. And then the same is true with the somatosensory. They know exactly what part of the body the signal came from. So if you cut your thumb, right, and you're feeling some pain there, we know exactly where that goes in the primary somatosensory. If you hit your elbow, right, maybe you bump your elbow in something, we know right where that goes. So this is known as the homunculus. Again, it's basically using this kind of cartoon little man drawing to show us where these neurons are either going to, if you're motor, or where they're coming from, if you're somatosensory. All right, then that leads us to association areas. So association areas perform more of the complex integrative functions. So what that means is they're going to be analyzing the senses. All right, they're going to be using memory. They're going to be using emotions and reasoning and judgment. They're going to use personality and intelligence to help basically interpret your senses. All right, so an example I like to give is with the somatosensory area, a somatosensory association area. Now remember, the somatosensory area is right here. So this area is helping to interpret. All right, so it helps to identify objects that you're touching. All right, so let's say you pick up a remote control to your TV, or you pick up your cell phone, and you can touch it and feel it. Right? Perceiving that it's in your hands is right here, the sensory area. But to interpret that, we need this somatosensory. Same thing with sight. Notice this yellow was the primary visual. That just allows you to perceive your vision. But this orange area is going to help you process that visual information and determine what that is that you're looking at. So I always like to use a clock as an example. Just perceiving that there's an object there is your primary visual. But now you're going to process that, right, using memory, reasoning, intelligence to be able to understand and read that clock. All right? Same thing with auditory, processing of the sound of music, for example, is auditory association area. Then we got the prefrontal area. So that's this area all the way in the front of the frontal lobe. This area here is really high level. So complex cognitive behavior, personality is a big one. So this prefrontal makes kind of you as far as your personality, decision making, social behavior. And what's interesting they found is this area of the brain doesn't fully develop till about you're 25. All right, so this is probably why we don't do very smart things when we're teenagers. All right, I always tell my kids, you guys don't have a well-developed prefrontal area yet. That's why you're dumb. That's why you make dumb decisions, And we hope at some point, maybe by the time you're 25, you'll be making better decisions. All right? So prefrontal area is in front of the premotor area, which is in front of the motor area. So that's kind of how you go from here, here, here. Then there's a really interesting area back here in the parietal lobe called Wernicke's. Wernicke's is all about language. It's your ability to interpret the meaning behind spoken words. All right, so it's an association area, right? So it's interpreting information, but it's information dealing with language. So when you're learning a new language, whether it's English or Spanish or French or anatomy, right? You use a lot of your Wernicke's area in this class because you're learning new words, and those words are spoken to you by me. So you use that Wernicke's area. Now, don't confuse Wernicke's with Broca's. Broca's was here. That was motor. All right, that's allowing you to speak. But in allowing you to interpret when spoken to is Wernicke's area. All right. Okay, what else? We've got white matter. So those areas we just learned about are in the gray matter. So notice if this is a frontal section, kind of a drawing of a brain, so it's a little bit different looking, but remember what a frontal or coronal section is. Now we can see the distinct gray matter known as the cerebral cortex. So all those sensory, motor, association areas were in this gray matter. But if you go deeper in, you see a lot of the white matter. So this would all be white matter in here. All right, and then these would be those basal ganglia or basal nuclei, but we're not really going to get into those. So what is the white matter doing? Well, you'll notice the white matter is just sending signals. All right, remember, white matter is highly myelinated, and you have to send signals throughout the brain, in and out of the brain, between the two hemispheres of the brain, and that's all doing what we call white matter tracks. So it's kind of like the tracks in the spinal cord, but the brain does more than just up and down. All right, whereas the spinal cord was ascending and descending, the brain does projection. All right, projection is either sending signals into the brain or into the cerebrum or out of the cerebrum. So projection is in and out. All right. Association is within. All right, within a hemisphere. So these kind of red ones are sending signals within the same hemisphere, but just different parts of that same hemisphere. And then commissural fiber tracts send signals between the two hemispheres. And there's a big track right here. Notice that signals from the right and left, all right, can cross at what's called the corpus callosum. That's a really important white matter track attaching the two hemispheres. So it's a commissural fiber track. Okay? All right. Let's kind of wrap this video up with this picture. I think we've done everything in here, but this is, again, a very important picture to know what you're looking at. We obviously have the cerebrum here, right? Parietal, occipital, frontal, all right? We see that corpus callosum. Again, that's part of the cerebrum, but that's that white matter commissural fiber tract. We already know the thalamus is here, hypothalamus, pituitary. And then we see the epithalamus, which houses the pineal gland. All right, so I even make the mistake sometimes. Don't mistake the pineal gland back here, melatonin, with the pituitary gland down here sticking off the hypothalamus. Midbrain, so this would be the cerebral peduncle here. And then recall we talked about the colliculi. The superior and inferior colliculi, those are found right here. This would be the superior colliculi for visual reflexes. And then underneath it is the inferior colliculi for auditory reflexes. And then cerebellum, white matter, arbor vitae, surrounded by the cerebellar cortex, pons, and medulla oblongata. So this image is very important to identify more of the kind of internal anatomy, and then we have that superficial picture of the real brain to identify more of the surface anatomy. All right, next video we're going to talk about the meninges, we're going to talk about cerebral spinal fluid, and then we'll eventually get into the cranial nerves.